Greetings YouTube, I'm sporting a gaming store shirt. It must be time for a gaming video. As I mentioned in my zombie season video, I thought I'd do a ghost video since we have the Halloween holiday coming up. So I thought I actually wrote crib notes. Thought I'd bring up 3 different scenarios that I used ghosts in the past. The first was one I think I've mentioned before. In fact, I know I've mentioned it before. It was a mad composer, and he had built this great bell tower, and I mean a great bell tower. The bell inside this tower was about 30 feet in diameter. It was over 200 feet high. It was one massive bronze bell. And he built an automatic, mechanical, steampunky kind of bell mechanism that would ring it to play a song, but over like a death dirge. It would take months and months for the whole song to be played. And unfortunately, he died before he finished his last composition. And so long as the bell kept playing and it was stuck on the on switch, his spirit could not be released. And he wandered in this valley, and he didn't know he was dead. And he would scare the bejesus out of people. Literally, like, paralyze them kind of thing, and like send them screaming in the night, sort of a scenario. And over the years, a pack of ghouls had begun to follow him around and prey upon his quote-unquote victims, even though they really weren't victims. He was trying to interact with people, trying to get some help to finish his piece. Enter the heroes. They find his bell tower. They eventually fight their way through the guardians that he had left behind, at least, mechanical devices and traps and such, because he was insane. And they eventually disable the tower, releasing his spirit. And then they get to loot the tower, which had lots of musical things in it, because one of the main characters, the fighter mage, or mage fighter, I guess, more mage levels than fighter levels, but whatever, was a composer himself and played musical instruments and things like that. The second one was kind of an Atlantean theme. It was kind of based off of the Isle of Minos. And it was a god sorcerer who had pretensions of being a god king. And one of the player characters needed to find a king's tear, an actual gem that had been formed from the tear of a king. And you imagine that kings being kings, they don't actually have sincere tears very often, like most politicians. So finding one isn't easy. But back in the Bronze Age of this world, I think it was Forgotten Realms, he had, again, pretensions of being a god king, pissed off a local god, and the local god had engulfed his island state in a tsunami of lava. Now, the king was an actual sorcerer king and very powerful. He was able to throw up a wall of force that covered his entire island in a dome. Awesome. He even planned to make sure that it had water and air. Everything's fine. Problem. When your entire island is covered in lava, it sinks, and now your island is trapped under a dome of stone, and no light gets in, which means no crops grow. Now the king, having tried this massive piece of magic, failed to save his wife from the catastrophe, and the queen died. He retired to the tomb that he had built for them both, in the event that he did not become a god king, laid his wife to rest, and then joined her, pretty much completely forgetting about his city. He just didn't care anymore. He was brokenhearted, hence the tear, and why the characters were coming to get the king's tear in question. And they finally get their way to the place. They find it completely populated with ghosts. Why? It was, well, as the people began to realize there was no food, some committed suicide, some starved to death. Those people became shades. They would just keep repeating the activities that they had done in life. But no spirits could escape from this island because of the magic that he had created. So these shades were harmless. They were just pantomiming what they had done in life. Very tragic. Some of the people here, however, became the eaters of the dead, and some of them became hunters of the living, until eventually there was one hunter left who committed suicide. And the hunters of the living and the eaters of the dead became hungry ghosts. So in walk the main player characters. They see the shades. Okay, no big deal, shades, they're harmless. But then they start encountering the hungry ghosts who want to eat them. And then they make a mad dash to find some place of safety, which they do find in the God King or Sorcerer King's tomb. They eventually crack the code that lets them open it, involved playing music and dancing. Again, composers and music themes were in the campaign. Crack it open, get the King's Tear, loot the bodies of treasure and such, because it was a temple of a tomb of a king and queen of an entire island empire, or kingdom, whatever you want to call it. And by doing this, by opening that tomb, they finally break the magic. And the ocean begins to flood into the city. So now the player characters have to make a mad dash for the top of the dome, trying to find a way out, which they do, and they make their way back to the surface. Adventures ensue. But that was a really interesting use of the ghosts for me, because I was able to really convince them of the panic of realizing that these ghosts are coming out of the woodwork, and they're running for their lives with literally a pack of ghosts chasing them, ripping and tearing at their flesh. Very much Night of the Living Dead thing, but with ghosts instead of zombies. And the last was an encounter they had while camping. It was a fairly ordinary camping event. But nearby had been the corpse in an unmarked grave of a girl. And she mistook one of the characters in the party as her brother Martin. Now, she had been dead for centuries. Her brother had been dead for centuries. But they were able to find her ghosts, find her corpse, dig her up, and they found a signet ring. A very important ring. And they took this with them, and by doing that, her ghost dissipated. But they marked her grave so they could find it again. They knew that someone was probably going to want to bury her. And then they began to do research, and it took a long time to do the research. This was an obscure family. And they discovered that in the ancient past, like 300 years in the past, there was going to be a marriage of convenience between two very powerful noble houses. One which was nouveau riche, and one which was old school, old money and old power. And that was where the girl came in. She was going to marry the nouveau riche family to bring some much needed money into the old family's coffers. But that really wasn't what the nouveau riche family leader wanted. He wanted to find a way of cheating this family. He knew that this daughter wasn't really interested in marrying his son, but he also knew that she was loyal to her family and was going to do it. And he needed her not to do it. He needed her to break that contract. So during the betrothal party, he had hired a bard to come in and woo her. Now, she didn't actually fall for it, but the guy was very good at convincing everyone at the party that he was such a charming guy that he would be the perfect person to steal a bride. And that night, the nouveau riche noble kidnapped the girl. At the same time, the bard disappeared into the night with his payment, took her away. I think he may have actually had his way with her, then murdered her and buried her in a shallow grave. Now, the patriarch of her family was distraught by this. The stories were rampant. His granddaughter had despoiled the family name, stolen the family signet ring, and he cursed all of his bloodline, laid down in his bed, and died out of maybe sheer mortification. Perchance he poisoned himself. The details were sketchy. One thing happened after another, and very shortly the nouveau riche family got most of the property of this old school family. They lost their entire fortune. Everything. They were thrust into the night with a name and nothing else. And over the centuries, their family grew smaller and smaller and smaller, one curse following them after another, until it came right down to the era where the player characters were, and there were 3 people left. All of them living with the elves in Myth Draenor, because at one point in their past, their family had helped the elves during the great battle that in most Forgotten Realms campaign wiped out Myth Draenor, but in my campaign did not. So they had the right of residency in Myth Draenor, and they had nowhere else to go. So they were living with the elves because the elves were the only ones that would take them in. So the player characters then had to go to Myth Draenor, big adventure. One of the main characters was half-elven, so there's all those kind of things going on. They'd never seen an elven city, yada, yada, yada. A lot of fun playing up the whole alienness of elves. Elves were very alien in my campaign. No one was allowed to play a full-blood elf. They were the other, very much. They convinced this family to come back to Cormyr, and that they would help break the curse by returning the signet ring to the family grave, which was now owned by the Newverreach family after all these centuries. So they essentially had to break into this family's grave, break into the tomb, and put the ring back into this coffin with the sarcophagus with the relative who had cursed the entire family line, breaking the curse. And when they did this, suddenly the fortunes exchanged. And the royal court suddenly heard the appeals that had been pending for 300 years. The Newverreach family was found to have breached the major contracts, all kinds of things. Not only did they have to return all of the lands that they had gotten in ill-gotten business deals from this older family, but they had to give them half of all the profits they had generated for like 300 years off of those lands, which broke their back financially. And suddenly, the player characters were in very good relationship with a newly flushed family who had a lot of money and a willingness to say thank you. They gave them a large piece of land near their estate where they founded a city. So it was all started off with this one simple encounter with a ghost, and I actually hadn't figured out where it was going to go to begin with. It was just going to be a ghost with a signet ring, and I figured out after the fact what I wanted to do with it. It was a toss-away, throwaway encounter that ended up becoming a major plot point in the campaign and eventually helped the player characters found an entire town of their own. I think it was called Crystal Dale, if I'm not incorrect. Yeah, you know how the Forgotten Realms, they love the Dales. They're everywhere. But that's how I've used some ghosts in the past. So I'm looking forward to hearing how people in the RPG community here on YouTube have used ghosts in your campaign. What have you done interestingly? How would you have used the ideas I've presented here in a different way? Or would you have played them out the way I did? So I want to know. Spread things around. Get people scared, because Halloween is on its way.